One cold October morning, a 20-year-old father stood on the edge of a quiet suburban street with nothing but a worn backpack hanging from one shoulder and a 3-week-old baby sleeping against his chest. Behind him, the front door slammed so hard the windows shook, and moments later his clothes, blankets, and the last few things he owned came flying across the front lawn as neighbors quietly watched from behind their curtains. No one stepped forward. No one asked if the baby had enough milk or whether the young father had anywhere to spend the night. Even the people who had promised to stand beside him believed becoming a father at 20 had destroyed the family's future. For several long seconds, he simply stood there, staring at the house where he had grown up, trying to understand how home could disappear in a single afternoon. Then something happened that nobody on that street would ever forget. One black SUV slowly turned the corner. Then another. Then another. Within less than a minute, nearly 20 luxury vehicles lined both sides of the road. Men and women dressed in tailored suits stepped out with the kind of calm confidence usually reserved for people who never worried about money. Every conversation stopped. Every phone came out. Even the parents who had forced him out walked back onto the porch, their expressions changing from anger to complete confusion. An older gentleman stepped forward, looked directly at the young father, then at the sleeping baby, and quietly said, "We've been searching for you." Those 4 words would uncover a family secret that had been hidden for months and completely change the lives of everyone standing on that street. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For the people living on that street, the story seemed to begin with the arrival of those black SUVs. In reality, it had started almost a year earlier, long before anyone imagined that a frightened 20-year-old would become responsible for raising a child on his own. The young man we'll call Ethan Carter had grown up in what appeared to be an ordinary middle-class American family. His father believed success came from following one strict path: finish school, build a career, get married, and only then think about children. Anything outside that order was considered failure. Ethan spent most of his teenage years trying to earn his father's approval, working after school, helping around the house, and keeping himself out of trouble. Friends described him as dependable rather than popular, the kind of young man who would stop to help a stranger change a flat tire without expecting anything in return. Then he met a young woman we'll call Emily Brooks. Their relationship wasn't built on luxury or grand promises. Like many young couples, they dreamed about finishing school, finding stable jobs, and eventually building a family together. Life, however, had different plans. When Emily discovered she was pregnant, fear quickly replaced excitement. Both of them understood exactly how their families would react. Ethan worried that his father would see the pregnancy as proof that he had thrown away every opportunity he had ever been given, while Emily carried a different burden, believing she had disappointed parents who had always expected perfection. Together they promised each other one thing above everything else: no matter how difficult life became, their baby would never feel abandoned. At that moment, neither of them realized how impossible that promise would soon become. Ethan Carter never imagined that one decision, made out of love instead of fear, would separate him from almost everyone he had ever known. Just months before the morning those black SUVs rolled into his neighborhood, his life looked very different. He was working long hours, trying to save every dollar he could while preparing for the arrival of his first child with Emily Brooks. They were young, overwhelmed, and fully aware that becoming parents at 20 would bring criticism from both families, but neither of them considered walking away. They believed they had time to figure things out together. Then everything changed in a matter of hours. Shortly after giving birth to their son, Emily suffered unexpected medical complications. Despite the efforts of doctors and nurses, she never made it home from the hospital. Ethan walked into the maternity ward expecting to begin the happiest chapter of his life, and walked out carrying a newborn in one arm and a grief so heavy that it barely allowed him to stand. In the space of a single day, he became both a first-time father and a grieving young man who had just lost the woman he loved. Instead of finding comfort, Ethan found blame waiting for him. His father quietly insisted that none of this would have happened if Ethan had focused on building a career before starting a family. His mother mourned the future she believed her son had thrown away, and before long, every family gathering became another reminder that he no longer belonged. Relatives lowered their voices whenever he entered the room, convinced he couldn't hear the conversations about how his life was already ruined. Friends who once called every weekend suddenly became too busy to answer their phones. Invitations disappeared. Text messages stopped coming. One by one, the people Ethan thought would stand beside him slowly stepped away until the only person depending on him was the tiny baby sleeping in a bassinet beside his bed. At just 20 years old, while most people his age were worrying about college classes, weekend plans, or their first apartments, Ethan was learning how to warm bottles at 2 in the morning, calm endless crying, and somehow keep moving even though every room reminded him of Emily. Yet through all the heartbreak, one mystery refused to leave his mind. Emily had often spoken warmly about her family. She described parents who valued hard work, grandparents who adored children, and relatives who stayed close through every hardship. They weren't people who simply vanished when someone needed help. So why hadn't a single member of the Brooks family called after Emily's passing? Why had no one attended the funeral? Why had nobody asked about the baby who carried their blood? Ethan searched through old contacts, sent messages that were never answered, and even questioned whether Emily had been hiding something from him during the months they spent planning their future together. The silence made no sense. It was as though an entire family had disappeared overnight. Then, without warning, after months of unanswered questions and unbearable loneliness, that silence was shattered by the arrival of a convoy so extraordinary that it brought an entire neighborhood to a standstill. The people stepping out of those vehicles weren't strangers who had taken a wrong turn. They had been searching for Ethan all along, and the reason it had taken them so long to find him would reveal a truth that no one on that street, and certainly not Ethan himself, could have imagined. After Emily Brooks was gone, Ethan Carter tried to convince himself that if he worked hard enough, stayed respectful enough, and carried every burden without complaint, his family would eventually see how desperately he was trying to do the right thing. Instead, the atmosphere inside the house grew heavier with each passing day. Every bottle of baby formula sitting on the kitchen counter became another reminder, in his father's eyes, that Ethan had chosen responsibility too soon. Every late-night cry from the nursery echoed through the hallway, followed by frustrated sighs and slammed bedroom doors. Every package of diapers seemed to spark another conversation about money, sacrifice, and disappointment. What should have been an ordinary home slowly became a place where silence felt safer than speaking. Ethan spent most nights awake with his son, carefully rocking him back to sleep before sunrise, then leaving early for work with barely enough energy to make it through the day. He never complained because he believed that providing for his child was no longer a choice. It was the promise he had made to Emily, and it was the only promise he still had the power to keep. His father refused to see any of that. To him, the baby represented a lifetime of missed opportunities. More than once, he looked directly at Ethan and said, "He's your responsibility, not mine. You made this decision, so you deal with it." Those words stayed with Ethan long after the conversations ended. His mother approached things differently, but her comments cut just as deeply. She often shook her head while folding laundry or washing dishes, telling Ethan that his future had already been decided. According to her, no woman would ever want to marry a 20-year-old single father carrying so much emotional baggage. She wasn't trying to comfort him or encourage him to keep going. She spoke as though she were announcing a sentence that could never be appealed. Meanwhile, Ethan's older brother found humor where everyone else found heartbreak. He laughed whenever the baby cried during dinner, joked that Ethan had traded freedom for sleepless nights, and reminded him at every opportunity that people their age were enjoying life while Ethan was changing diapers. Family meals became exercises in endurance. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same accusation. Ethan had embarrassed the family, and now everyone else was paying the price. Weeks turned into months, and the pressure became impossible to escape. Ethan paid for formula, diapers, and every expense he could manage, often skipping meals himself so his son would never go without. He cleaned the house after work, tried to keep the baby quiet at night, and did everything possible to avoid creating more tension. None of it mattered. The criticism never stopped. Every morning seemed to begin with another reminder that he wasn't welcome. Then came the evening that changed everything. After another argument over the sound of the baby crying, Ethan's father completely lost his temper. He pointed toward the front door and told his son he had exactly 1 hour to leave the house. There would be no discussion, no second chance, and no compromise. He wouldn't receive money for a motel, keys to the family car, or even help carrying his belongings outside. The only thing Ethan was allowed to take without question was his son. 60 minutes later, carrying one backpack, one diaper bag, and the baby sleeping against his chest, Ethan stepped onto the front lawn as the door closed behind him for what he believed would be the final time. Standing alone beneath the fading evening light, he honestly believed he had lost his home, his family, and every hope he had left. What Ethan didn't know was that while he had been fighting to survive one day at a time, another family had spent months searching across towns, hospitals, public records, and old addresses, determined to find the young father who had never abandoned Emily or their grandson. Their search was finally about to come to an end. While Ethan Carter struggled through each day believing he had been completely forgotten, another story was unfolding hundreds of miles away, one built on questions that refused to disappear. Emily Brooks had loved her family deeply, but she had also carried a fear that shaped the final months of her life. She worried they had sacrificed too much to give her every opportunity and believed revealing her pregnancy before she and Ethan had established stable careers would break their hearts. She convinced herself that she would tell them when the timing was right, after the baby was born, after she and Ethan had found their footing, after she could introduce them to the family she dreamed of building instead of the crisis she feared they would see. That conversation never happened. Following Emily's passing, her parents were devastated by more than the loss of their daughter. As they sorted through the personal belongings returned from her apartment and the hospital, they uncovered a collection of sealed letters, photographs, handwritten journal pages, appointment cards, ultrasound images, and hospital documents that revealed a life she had quietly kept hidden from them. Every page told the same story. Emily had never been abandoned. She had never been facing parenthood alone. Again and again, one name appeared beside hers. Ethan Carter. The letters painted a picture completely different from what Emily's parents had imagined. She wrote about Ethan attending every doctor's appointment he could, working extra shifts to save money for the baby, assembling a crib with his own hands, and reassuring her whenever fear overwhelmed her. She described him as a man who refused to run from responsibility even when everyone around them warned that becoming a father at 20 would destroy his future. One letter, written only weeks before their son was born, brought Emily's mother to tears. In it, Emily wrote that if anything ever happened to her, she wanted her parents to know that Ethan loved both her and their child with every part of his heart. She begged them not to judge him by his age, but by the sacrifices he willingly made every single day. Those words changed everything. Emily's parents realized they had spent months grieving without even knowing they had a grandson somewhere in the country, or that the young man their daughter trusted most was carrying unimaginable pain entirely on his own. They immediately began searching, but finding Ethan proved far more difficult than they expected. His phone number no longer worked. The apartment he and Emily had shared had been emptied. Friends had lost contact with him, and public records led to outdated addresses. Every answer seemed to create another question. Determined not to lose the last connection they had to their daughter, Emily's parents hired experienced private investigators to continue the search. Weeks turned into months as investigators followed employment records, hospital paperwork, forwarding addresses, and scattered pieces of information left behind after Ethan's life had fallen apart. Finally, one report arrived with a current location. The investigators had found him, but the details inside the file left Emily's parents speechless. Instead of discovering a reckless young man living carelessly, they found a devoted father surviving one day at a time. After being forced out of his parents' home, Ethan had spent nights moving between inexpensive roadside motels whenever he could afford a room. On the hardest nights, when every dollar had to go toward formula and diapers, he slept inside his aging car with the baby safely wrapped in blankets beside him, parking under well-lit areas because he believed they were safer. Surveillance photographs showed him arriving at work exhausted after another sleepless night, carrying the baby into daycare before starting his shift, then picking him up the moment work ended. Every decision Ethan made centered on protecting his son, even if it meant sacrificing his own comfort, pride, and future. As Emily's parents quietly studied those reports, they realized something that filled them with both heartbreak and admiration. The young man their daughter had trusted had kept every promise he had ever made to her. In that moment, they reached a decision that would forever change Ethan Carter's life. They would not simply introduce themselves as distant relatives. They were going to bring him and their grandson home as members of their family, and they intended to make sure he would never again have to wonder where he belonged. The next morning, Ethan Carter woke before sunrise with almost no idea where the day would take him. His son was still asleep against his chest inside the aging car that had become their shelter for the night. The parking lot was quiet except for a few early commuters, and for a brief moment Ethan allowed himself to believe that if he could just make it through one more day, somehow things would begin to improve. He cleaned the baby's bottle with the last of the bottled water he had saved, changed his diaper in the back seat, and quietly apologized to his son for circumstances neither of them had chosen. He had no permanent address, no plan beyond finding enough work to buy more formula, and no family willing to answer his calls. Yet even after losing Emily Brooks, losing his home, and losing the support of the people who had raised him, he refused to let himself believe that his son would ever grow up thinking his father had abandoned him. That single promise was all he had left. Later that morning, Ethan returned to his parents' neighborhood for one simple reason. In the rush to leave the previous evening, he had been unable to gather everything belonging to the baby. Emily's framed photograph, a small blanket she had purchased during her pregnancy, and a few boxes of infant supplies were still sitting inside the garage. He parked carefully across the street, hoping to collect the remaining items without creating another confrontation. Before he could even reach the front yard, the distant sound of approaching engines echoed through the neighborhood. One black SUV slowly turned onto the street. Then another followed behind it. Within moments, the quiet suburban road filled with a procession of polished luxury vehicles stretching farther than anyone could remember seeing. Curtains opened in nearly every house. Neighbors stepped outside, some still holding coffee mugs, while others instinctively reached for their phones and began recording. Children stopped riding their bicycles. Delivery drivers pulled over. No one understood why such an extraordinary motorcade had arrived in an ordinary neighborhood where nothing ever happened. Even Ethan's parents came outside, their expressions shifting from irritation to complete bewilderment as the vehicles came to a smooth stop directly in front of their home. Uniformed drivers exited first, followed by several professionally dressed men and women who quietly positioned themselves beside the SUVs. There was no shouting, no display of intimidation, only an unmistakable sense of purpose. Finally, the rear door of the lead vehicle opened. An elegant elderly couple stepped onto the sidewalk. The woman paused the moment she saw the baby in Ethan's arms. Tears immediately welled in her eyes, as though she were looking at someone she had been praying to meet for months. She approached slowly, careful not to frighten either Ethan or the child. With gentle hesitation, she asked if she could hold her grandson. Ethan looked into her eyes and saw genuine heartbreak rather than entitlement. He carefully placed the baby into her arms. She held him close, quietly whispering through tears that he looked so much like Emily Brooks that it almost took her breath away. Around them, the entire neighborhood fell silent. The elderly gentleman stepped forward and extended his hand toward Ethan. His face carried the weight of grief, but also immense respect. He looked directly into Ethan's eyes before speaking words that no one standing nearby would ever forget. "You kept your promise to our daughter." Ethan stood speechless. The neighbors exchanged confused glances. His own parents looked at one another, unable to understand what they were witnessing. The gentleman continued, explaining that Emily had written about Ethan constantly. She had described his kindness, his determination, and his refusal to leave when life became difficult. Every letter they discovered after her passing confirmed the same truth. While others questioned him because of his age, Emily never doubted the kind of father he would become. She believed he would protect their child no matter the cost, and everything the investigators had uncovered proved she had been right. For months, they had searched tirelessly for the young man their daughter trusted with her future, only to discover he had been surviving alone while carrying responsibilities that many people twice his age would struggle to bear. Only then did another truth become impossible to ignore. Emily Brooks' family was quietly known throughout the region for building one of the most successful privately owned business groups in the state over several generations. They had never sought public attention. They avoided headlines, political influence, and celebrity culture. Their reputation had been built through decades of disciplined work, successful companies, and a commitment to helping the communities where they operated. Their wealth had never been the point of their journey. Family had always come first, and now they saw Ethan as the last living connection to the daughter they had lost. They had not arrived to impress the neighborhood with expensive vehicles or financial success. They had arrived because they refused to let their grandson and the man who had protected him spend another night wondering where they belonged. From that day forward, Ethan was no longer viewed as an outsider carrying someone else's burden. They embraced him as family because, when everyone else chose rejection, he had chosen responsibility. As several staff members carefully retrieved Ethan's remaining belongings, including Emily's photograph, the baby's crib, and the few possessions he still owned, his father finally stepped forward. The confidence that had filled his voice the night before had disappeared. Looking at the people surrounding Ethan with respect instead of judgment, he quietly admitted he had been wrong. His mother wiped away tears as relatives who had once criticized Ethan suddenly tried to explain that they only wanted what was best for him. The same people who had called him a failure were now asking for another chance, hoping to repair relationships that had been shattered by fear and pride. Ethan listened respectfully, but his eyes kept returning to his son, peacefully sleeping in the arms of Emily's mother. In that moment, he understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Forgiveness is possible, but trust is far more difficult to restore. Some bridges can be rebuilt with time, honesty, and change. Others remain lasting reminders of the people who walked away when they were needed most. The months that followed marked the beginning of a life Ethan Carter had stopped believing was possible. For the first time since Emily Brooks had passed away, he no longer woke up wondering where he and his son would sleep that night or whether he could afford enough formula to make it through the week. Emily's parents welcomed them into their home without conditions, without contracts, and without making Ethan feel as though he owed them something he could never repay. They gave him a room, but more importantly, they gave him peace. The constant tension that had followed him for months slowly disappeared. Instead of criticism every time the baby cried, there were smiles. Instead of arguments over diapers and bottles, there were grandparents eager to take turns feeding their grandson, reading to him, and holding him through the night so Ethan could finally get a full night's sleep for the first time in what felt like forever. The house that had once echoed with grief gradually became filled with laughter as Emily's son began reaching milestones that everyone feared they might never witness together. Every first smile, every first laugh, and every first step became a reminder that although Emily was gone, the love she left behind continued growing stronger with each passing day. Ethan never allowed the family's generosity to become an excuse for complacency. He remembered every cold night spent inside his aging car and every moment he had questioned whether he would be enough for his son. Those memories became fuel rather than scars. Encouraged by Emily's parents, he enrolled once again in college to finish the education he had placed on hold after becoming a father. His days became a careful balance of classes, parenting, and work. Whenever he wasn't studying or caring for his son, he accepted an entry-level position within one of the companies owned by Emily's family. Despite what outsiders assumed, no special treatment was waiting for him. Emily's father made one thing very clear on Ethan's first day. "You'll earn your place here exactly the same way everyone else does." Ethan welcomed those words because he had never wanted sympathy. He wanted opportunity. He arrived before everyone else, stayed after most employees had gone home, asked questions, accepted criticism, and slowly earned the respect of co-workers who eventually stopped seeing him as the owner's late daughter's partner and began seeing him as one of the hardest working people in the company. As the months turned into years, a remarkable bond developed between Ethan and Emily's father. It was never built on replacing anyone or rewriting the past. The older man never attempted to become the father Ethan had lost emotionally years earlier. Instead, he became the mentor Ethan had desperately needed. Almost every morning before work, they shared coffee together, talking about business, fatherhood, responsibility, and the difficult choices life sometimes forces upon ordinary people. During one conversation that Ethan would remember for the rest of his life, the older man placed a hand on his shoulder and quietly said, "A father isn't measured by his age. He's measured by the sacrifices he's willing to make." Those words settled deeply into Ethan's heart because they described every decision he had made since the day his son was born. He had never claimed to have all the answers. He had simply refused to walk away when walking away would have been easier. Hearing those words from the man who had lost his only daughter felt like receiving a blessing Emily herself would have wanted him to hear. Years passed, and the frightened 20-year-old who had once stood on a sidewalk with nothing but a backpack and a newborn slowly became a confident man whose determination inspired everyone around him. He completed his education, advanced through the company by proving himself rather than relying on family connections, and built a reputation for honesty that clients and colleagues respected. Eventually, after years of saving, investing wisely, and working relentlessly, Ethan achieved something that once seemed impossible. He purchased a home of his own. It wasn't handed to him as a gift, and it wasn't bought with inherited wealth. It was the result of discipline, long hours, and opportunities he refused to waste. On moving day, Emily's parents stood beside him as his son, now old enough to understand the meaning of home, ran excitedly from room to room imagining where his toys would go. Ethan paused for a moment on the front porch and thought back to the afternoon when he had been ordered to leave his parents' house with nothing but a diaper bag and shattered dreams. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. Everything he had built traced back to a single moment when one family looked beyond his age, his circumstances, and his mistakes, choosing instead to recognize his character. While others had judged him for becoming a young single father, Emily Brooks' family saw something far more valuable, a young man who had honored every promise he had made to the woman they loved and to the child they had brought into the world together. That decision changed not only Ethan's future, but the future of generations that would come after him. Years later, when Ethan Carter was asked how he managed to survive the darkest chapter of his life, he never began his answer by talking about success, business, or the comfortable home he eventually built. He always went back to that quiet suburban street, to the afternoon when his belongings were scattered across the front lawn, and to the tiny babies sleeping peacefully in his arms while he wondered whether they would have a roof over their heads that night. At the time, it felt like the end of everything he had ever known. The rejection from his own family left wounds that would never completely disappear. Losing Emily Brooks had already shattered his heart, and being turned away by the people he expected to stand beside him made the future seem impossible to imagine. Yet with the passing of time, Ethan realized that what felt like the worst day of his life had quietly become the first page of a completely different story. If he had never been forced to leave, Emily's parents might never have found him when they did. If he had remained surrounded by constant criticism, his son might have grown up believing that love was something people gave only when life was easy. Instead, that little boy grew up in a home where every birthday was celebrated, every school achievement was applauded, and every reminder of his mother was treated with honor instead of silence. He grew up hearing stories about Emily's kindness, her courage, and the dreams she carried for him long before he entered the world. Most importantly, he grew up watching a father who never allowed hardship to become an excuse for giving up. As for Ethan, he never forgot where he came from. Success did not erase the memories of sleeping inside an aging car or counting every dollar before buying another can of formula. Those experiences stayed with him, shaping the way he treated employees, neighbors, and complete strangers who found themselves facing impossible circumstances. Whenever he met a young parent struggling to build a future, he saw pieces of his younger self and offered encouragement without judgment. Emily's parents often said that their daughter would have been proud of the man Ethan had become, not because he achieved financial stability or professional success, but because he never compromised the values she loved most about him. He remained humble, devoted to his son, and deeply grateful for the second family that had opened their hearts when he needed them most. The convoy that once captured the attention of an entire neighborhood was never really about expensive vehicles or the reputation of a successful family. Those black SUVs carried something far more valuable than wealth. They carried forgiveness for years that could never be reclaimed, hope for a child who deserved to know both sides of his family, and a promise that neither Ethan nor Emily's son would ever have to face the future alone again. The people who once whispered that Ethan Carter had ruined his life eventually watched from a distance as he built the very future they believed was impossible. Some relationships slowly healed through sincere apologies and consistent change. Others remained only memories, reminders that trust, once broken, takes far longer to rebuild than words alone can accomplish. Ethan chose not to live with bitterness because he understood that carrying resentment would only steal the peace he had fought so hard to find. Instead, he focused on the people who had stood beside him when he had nothing to offer except honesty, determination, and unconditional love for his child. Looking back, he understood that life sometimes closes one door so another can open in ways no one could have imagined. The family he was born into gave him his beginning, but the family that chose him gave him the opportunity to become the father, the man, and the example his son would one day remember with pride. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within Ethan Carter's journey. The people who walk away from you are not always writing the final chapter of your story. Sometimes, without realizing it, they are simply making room for the people who were always meant to stand beside you. Final line. The family you're born into shapes your beginning, but the family that chooses you can change your entire future.